Chris Hensley is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research, Inc., a broker-dealer member of FINRA SIPC, investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, Inc., a registered investment advisor. Cambridge and Houston First Financial Group are not affiliated.
The Houston Midtown chapter of the Society for Financial Awareness presents Money Matters with your host, Christopher Hensley.
Good morning, everybody. You're listening to Money Matters on KPFT Houston. I'm Chris Hensley. The time is now 11 a.m., so I'm trying to get that one right. For the last 4 years, I've said the time is now 10 a.m. It's 11. We've moved up to the 11 a.m. spot. We are here between Democracy Now! And Tom Hartman, so it should be a good spot for us, but it is change, and with change, there's always new adjustments to behavior. So with that, let's go ahead and do kind of a sneak peek into what we will be talking about today. And while the hyper-partisanship in Washington that has stunned the world has been building for decades, Ira Shapiro argues that the U.S. Senate has suffered most acutely from the loss of its political center. In Broken, Ira Shapiro, former senior Senate staffer and author of the critically acclaimed book The Last Great Senate, offers an expert account of some of the most prominent battles of the past decade and lays out what must be done to restore the Senate's lost luster. With a narrative that runs right through the first year of Trump's presidency, Broken will be essential reading for all concerned about the state of American politics and the future of our country. So we are very, very happy to have Ira Shapiro on the show today. So please stay tuned. Keep listening. We will do kind of a deep dive into what his newest book is about. But if you are a longtime listener of the show, you know we always use just the first few minutes of the show or so to tell you kind of what's going on in the Houston and the Gulf Coast region when it comes to financial literacy. I am part of the Houston Money Week leadership team. That is an event that used to be just a week long in April, but it has taken up the entire month in celebration of Financial Literacy Month. With that, we have really different events that take place free of charge to low, moderate income, really everybody who wants assistance with financial literacy, with college planning, with tax planning, that sort of stuff, free at no charge. One of the events that we are doing, and we've done this for the last, I think this is the third or fourth year that I've been part of this, is that we are part of an event that the Houston Hispanic Forum does. This year it's going to be the 32nd annual Career and Education Day. Now, when I talk about this event, if you're in the Houston area, you know the George R. Brown Convention Center. This is a giant convention center that takes up about 3 city blocks. Each and every year, the Houston Hispanic Forum has one of the largest college and career education day for teens, middle schoolers, high schoolers, and it is a free event. They will bus students in. We will talk about things such as career panels. There's going to be STEM research there, the FBI. Let's see, what else have we got on here? There's free lunch, for one thing. That's always a good thing. If you have children that are under middle school age, there are activities and things for them to do as well. Financial aid, counselor track, exhibitors are going to include 100+ different colleges, trade schools, businesses. So come on out. It is free. In fact, you can, if you go to the Houston Hispanic Forum's website, there is a link where you can print your free Metro Pass that the bus will get you there for free as well. To find out more, you can go to Houston Hispanic Forum's website and find out information about that. With that, very excited about that event, but I've got Ira on the line, so let's go ahead and get started with Ira because I want to make sure that we have as much time as we possibly can. Ira, are you there?
Yes, Chris, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining the show this morning. And I wanted to share just a little bit about your bio with listeners so they can get to know you as well. Now, you are a lawyer, former trade ambassador under President Clinton. Your passion and involvement with the Senate stretches all the way back to 1969 when you interned for New York Senator Jacob Javits. By 1975, you were back in D.C., legal counsel for Michigan Senator Gaylord Nelson, founder of Earth Day. You counseled Robert Byrd, was the first chief of staff for Senator Jay Rockefeller, and sat on the legal teams vetting vice president options for both President Clinton and Vice President Al Gore. Whew, okay, I'm out of breath. That's a lot.
Chris, you've captured it, except footnote, Gaylord Nelson was from Wisconsin, not Michigan.
All right, I'm putting
but everything else you said was accurate. And my reaction to it is, boy, this guy must be old.
I'm putting an asterisk there next to the spelling.
Yeah.
So tell me something outside of the bio so that we can get to know you just a little bit better.
Married almost 50 years to Nancy Shapiro, who I met the first day of college. 2 children and 2 grandsons who live in the area, the Washington area. So other people who come to Washington say it's temporary or they threaten to leave. We're not going anywhere because the family's around here.
There you go. So let's dive right into it. The book, the newest book, Broken, Can the Senate Save Itself in the Country? Why did you write this book?
Well, it's actually the second book I've written about the Senate, Chris. I wrote one 6 years ago that was called The Last Great Senate, which looked back on the Senate of the late 70s, which was a very productive Senate, and tried to explain in narrative history terms to show how it worked, why it was successful. I wanted to recall the great senators, but I also wanted to recall how they worked together as a Senate. And I circled back to write the book because 30 years later, or 20 years later after I left the Senate, it was failing. It was clearly on a long downhill decline, and I wanted to write a book that might show how it had worked. Well, I guess I did that, but the book didn't stop the decline. So 6 years later, I've come back with a tougher book, less nostalgia and a tougher book, sort of trying to describe what's happened in very specific terms, and who's responsible, and what are the forces at work, but who's responsible. And that led me to, and the last thing I would say about it in introduction, Chris, is this. Donald Trump dominates our political landscape, and that's understandable. This is an extraordinary presidency. I started writing the book in 2016 when I was quite sure that Hillary Clinton was going to win, because I didn't think she'd be able to govern unless the Senate got better. So while my book covers the first 9 months of Trump's presidency, it was not motivated by Donald Trump. It was motivated by a concern that the Senate was failing.
So that's very telling there, because whether it's Trump or Hillary, you started writing this book with the feeling that something has happened to the Senate. What has happened?
Well, I think there's no doubt about some of what has happened. I think everyone knows that the Senate is broken at this point and the victim of excessive partisanship and unable to overcome that. But what I found in writing the book, I sort of suspected this actually, but the Senate's decline has been very long, about 25 years, I would say. And if you think about the Senate's decline being that long, if you were going to diagram it on a graph, it would sort of be long and gradual and then takes a deep dive. It spirals downward when Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell become the leadership team. And it's continued downward in a period of time that I believe has been, by and large, dominated by Senator McConnell. So that's sort of the broad picture. But so what you have is there are a lot of forces in our country that we're all aware of that make our politics difficult. genuine divisions among the parties, wide divisions. The cost of campaigns, the changing media, the gerrymandered districts, a lot of things that make our politics difficult. And then there are individual actors and the role they play. And in my view, and the book discusses this, and people can make their own judgments, but our politics today are primarily the product of one person, and that's Senator McConnell.
Wow, that's a lot of things leading up to
it a lot, so I tried to summarize it briefly. But we can unpack it a little bit.
Absolutely. So let's kind of drill down on one of the things that's in the book. When you talk about bipartisanship, you say bipartisanship. Let me see if I can say that there. Bipartisanship, tried, lost, and found. What does that mean?
What that means, that in that particular chapter, I was referring to when President George W. Bush came into office. He came in after an extraordinary and irregular election, and yet he got support from Democrats for his tax cuts. He got support from Ted Kennedy for No Child Left Behind, his education reform. The Senate, I don't agree with all of those things, but the Senate was working on a bipartisan basis. Then they lost it for a while because they bogged down arguing about other things. Well, sorry, he also got support, unfortunately, for the invasion of Iraq. So they lost it, started fighting about judicial nominations, etc. At the very end of the Bush administration, and this is very important, we faced the financial crisis triggered by the fall of Lehman Brothers, the whole subprime mortgage crisis, and all of a sudden we're in a crisis of unprecedented proportions. October 2008. Ben Bernanke, who is the chairman of the Fed, and the Secretary of Treasury, Henry Paulson, go up to the Hill, and Bernanke says to the leaders, if we don't act this weekend, we won't have an economy on Monday. And that's pretty shocking. One of the leaders who's there is Mitch McConnell, who understands the crisis immediately and takes strong action. He's a strong leader in the next week to produce the legislation that we call TARP. And then the House, in its irresponsible way, votes down the legislation. The market falls 777 points, which used to sound like a lot until this week.
Right.
Senator McConnell goes to the Senate floor, and he makes a speech reassuring the country that the Senate will act and we'll deal with this emergency. And the Senate does act. And then the House changes position, reverses itself with given a second chance. And we get the TARP legislation, which, while it later became unpopular, was fundamentally important to saving. This is a long story, and I'm sorry. Saving the financial system. And McConnell's very proud of the role he plays. You can read it in his memoir, and he should be proud of it. Except 90 days later, when the economy is still on the verge of the Great Depression, he opposes everything that Barack Obama does to try to save the economy by stimulating it. He opposes it even before it's proposed. He cares about nothing at that point other than Barack Obama's approval ratings and taking him down. We wouldn't have an economic recovery if it hadn't been for Senators Collins, Snow from Maine, and Specter from Pennsylvania. So I can't think of any political leader in my lifetime that would have behaved that way. He changed overnight because we had a different president. And that's the beginning of the McConnell story in 2009, and it doesn't get any better.
One of the sections in the book you talk about strict obstructionism. This is a good lead-in for that.
Yeah.
Tell me some more about that.
I think that if you compare the obstructionism of Senator McConnell to any that happened previously, you would find that it was the only time that the obstruction of the Senate occurred continuously from the leader. In other words, other leaders had trouble with Jesse Helms or Senator Allen or various other individual problems, Ted Cruz more recently. But we're talking about obstruction that came from the leader. And basically, very effective obstruction, by the way. I think Senator McConnell is a very, very gifted politician. But he has run the Senate, in the minority, he was an unprecedented obstructionist. And he did that for 6 years and caused a lot of harm to our country and the operation of the government. Now, why do I say 6 years? Because in the 7th year, 2015, he became majority leader in the Senate. Obama's still president. All of a sudden, the Senate starts working. They're cranking out bipartisan legislation. It's the best year in a long time for the Senate. The only thing that changed was that the principal obstructionist became a constructive player. The other senators can do that work, but he changed. That change lasted exactly 1 year and 1 month. Because then Justice Scalia died, and Senator McConnell made his unprecedented statement that the Senate would not consider any nominee for the Supreme Court that Obama put forth. And the Senate dissolved into bitterness again. So we have had a Senate that has gone down and down and down, and it's been very closely related to the actions of one man.
Let's fast forward a little bit now and talk about the polarized Senate meets the insurgent president. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, the general view of those who thought, as I did, that Hillary Clinton would win, were concerned that Mrs. Clinton or Secretary Clinton wouldn't do any better with McConnell than Barack Obama had. Donald Trump winning obviously changes the game. All of a sudden you have a Republican president, although, an outside Republican president, sort of an unpredictable Republican president. So how did they do together? And the answer is the first year, mixed. I can point to some things where I thought the Senate did well. But the prevailing theme of the first year was Senator McConnell trying to steamroller the Senate into passing the repeal of the Affordable Health Care Act, Obama's signature achievement. McConnell trying to do it without hearings, without committee action, without consultation, and coming close to doing it. And when he fails the first time to do it, he says, we'll move on to tax reform. And then, having said that and pledged that, he comes back a week later or 2 weeks later and tries again on health care. Tries it a third time. Unprecedented stuff. So you have the obstructionist has now become kind of a steamroller once in the majority.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the new presidency, the confirmation battles that we've seen over the president's team? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think that, look, we all remember that it was a transition period. Well, we all remember it was a shocking election result, and a transition period unlike any other. And by that I mean two things. One, a president who didn't reach out, president-elect who didn't broaden his appeal, didn't reach out to anybody else. That was kind of unexpected. The second was, and in response to the election and to the transition, the resistance in the streets, people that mobilized against President Trump before he came into office. So the confirmation process occurred in an extraordinary environment, right? And it was a very polarized process. Not all of the nominees passed with just 50 or 51 or 52 votes, where the Democrats were solidly against them and the Republicans were solidly for them. That's not the way a process should work. The way it should work is the good nominees get a lot of votes, and if there's a bad nominee, you either force them to withdraw or maybe you defeat them. Tom Price at HHS, Scott Pruitt at EPA, but particularly Price because of the investments that had been made in the healthcare sector. He should never have been confirmed for anything. But we had a totally partisan process at that time. And let me say one thing to give you the sense of the bitterness in the atmosphere. Senator Schumer, who was thrown into the job all of a sudden of being the leading Democrat in the country under extraordinary circumstances, he's the minority leader. He's got a real tough job. He votes against Elaine Chao to be Secretary of Transportation. Elaine Chao is a superbly qualified nominee, probably the first or second best in the cabinet of Mr. Trump. She's also Senator McConnell's wife. Got 93 votes. Schumer votes against her. What's the point of that if they're going to be working together? But it was a poisoned atmosphere.
So it feels as though we are in new territory here with this presidency.
Oh, no, absolutely, Chris. And one of my dangers as a Senate guy is I filibuster too much. We're in new territory. The Senate, we've never been here, and the worst of it is we have a weakened, dramatically weakened Senate at a time that a constitutional crisis may well be rolling toward us.
This is important information for people to know. The book is Broken. Can the Senate Save Itself and the Country? We were talking today with Ira Shapiro. Ira, I would be remiss to not discuss this with you while I have you on the show. Investigating the Russian connection. Can you give us some insight into that?
Well, I think all of us certainly have been following the Russia problem with Trump. And I think my point in the chapter there, in reviewing it, was actually to express some confidence that the senators took this issue very seriously from the time of Jim Comey being fired. I think that the senators, it's not health care or taxes. I think they see the Russia issue differently. And I hope that they will be the safeguard that we need if President Trump either fires Rod Rosenstein or Special Counsel Mueller, or the alternative, Mueller finishes his report. The report is a damning indictment of Trump or Trump's presidency or the White House, and the president fights it. It's very crucial at that point to have senators who are the balance wheel in the system. The Senate has failed for so long that we can't be totally confident, but I was saying that I felt that people would step up at that point.
That's what we're, when it's not broken, that's the way it's supposed to work. So we're some wood. I'm knocking on wood here.
No, that's exactly right. The way it worked in Watergate when it wasn't broken.
Absolutely.
It's now much worse situation because Richard Nixon, for all of his faults, was a successful president in many ways. And that's not the case, I believe, with President Trump. But the most important thing, people can make their own judgments when Mueller reports or if Mueller is fired. But the Senate is the balance wheel in the system if it works correctly.
One of the sections in the book, and from the finance side of it, when I hear this is the thing that makes the hair stick up on the back of my neck here. America versus the world. Seeing some of the stuff that multinational trade agreements being unwound. What can you tell us about America versus the world?
I wrote that chapter as a former trade official. I wrote that chapter because I was thinking, okay, we have a president who's going to change our policy toward the world on immigration, on trade, and on climate change. I don't believe in one-man rule. So what is the Congress doing about it? They're supposed to do some things. And the interesting thing is, on trade, and this is obviously important to a Houston audience, I think that the Senate Republicans are pushing back quite hard against NAFTA withdrawal. They are basically, they're distilling what all the diverse economic interests in our country are saying, that NAFTA withdrawal would be a very bad idea that could harm the economy, ruin the North American supply chain, and ruin the global operations of many companies, and hurt agriculture as well. So they're pushing back, and I think they're having an effect. That's a healthy action by the Senate. Contrast it for a moment with climate change. President Trump takes us out of the Paris Agreement. He can do that. He has the authority. But past Senates would have made sure that there were hearings on that. Republican chairmen would have made sure that all the views got ventilated, and maybe they would have influenced the president. That didn't happen this time.
So those are huge issues. You talked about immigration, you talked about trade, climate control, all of these things where in the past we've seen at least there would be hearings, there would be some discussion.
Well, of course, and you're right, and I should have said, on immigration, one of the hardest issues there is. But 5 years ago, 2013, the Senate passed comprehensive immigration legislation led by the bipartisan Gang of 8. 73 votes in the Senate. The House didn't take it up. But the Senate knew how to pass an immigration bill at that time. And the Senate is still struggling and working to figure out how to balance protecting the dreamers against the border security questions, most dramatically the Trump wall. The Senate's engaged in that, at least. The Senate was engaged in trade. The Senate took a pass on climate change terribly. So, you can see different issues being handled different ways.
Absolutely. Ira, we are right here towards the end of the show. Got just a couple minutes left. What have I forgot to ask you that you would like to share with listeners about your book?
You've asked me everything, Chris, except to say, here's the thing. I've obviously been quite critical of Senator McConnell because I do think he's instrumental. But I put a lot of it on the senators, too. They know how it's supposed to work. They can push back against the leader-driven Senate. They could replace the leader if they wanted to replace the leader. This isn't some family business that they're running into the ground here. This is the United States Senate. It's really important, and they ought to stop whining about the fact that it's broken and change it.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Money Matters Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, visit us on the web at www.moneymatterspodcast.com.
drop us a line on SpeakPipe on the right-hand corner. It will receive any voicemails, questions, thoughts, concerns that you have about the show. In addition to this, we recently launched a Patreon campaign. Click on the Donate Now tab to hit the tip jar and find out what Patreon's campaign is all about.